Chapter 19 of The Portrait of a Lady by Henry James. This recording is in the public domain. As Mrs. Touchett had foretold, Isabel and Madame Merle were thrown much together during the illness of their host, so that if they had not become intimate it would have been almost a breach of good manners. Their manners were of the best, but in addition to this they happened to please each other. It is perhaps too much to say that they swore an eternal friendship, but tacitly at least they called the future to witness. Isabel did so with a perfectly good conscience, though she would have hesitated to admit she was intimate with her new friend in the high sense she privately attached to this term. She often considered, indeed, if she ever had been, or ever could be, intimate with any one. She had an ideal of friendship, as well as of several other sentiments, which it failed to seem to her in this case, it had not seemed to her in other cases, that the actual completely expressed. But she often reminded herself that there were essential reasons why one's ideal could never become concrete. It was a thing to believe in, not to see, a matter of faith, not of experience. Experience, however, might supply us with very creditable imitations of it, and the part of wisdom was to make the best of them. Certainly, on the whole, Isabel had never encountered a more agreeable and interesting figure than Madame Merle. She had never met a person having less of that fault which is the principal obstacle to friendship, the air of reproducing the more tiresome, the stale, the too familiar parts of one's own character. The gates of the girl's confidence were opened wider than they ever had been. She said things to this amiable auditress that she had not yet said to any one. Sometimes she took alarm at her candour. It was as if she had given to a comparative stranger the key to her cabinet of jewels. These spiritual gems were the only ones of any magnitude that Isabel possessed, but there was all the greater reason for their being carefully guarded. Afterwards, however, she always remembered that one should never regret a generous error, and that if Madame Merle had not the merit she attributed to her, so much the worse for Madame Merle. There was no doubt she had great merits. She was charming, sympathetic, intelligent, cultivated. More than this, for it had not been Isabel's ill fortune to go through life without meeting in her own sex several persons of whom no less could fairly be said. She was rare, superior, and pre-eminent. There are many amiable people in the world, and Madame Merle was far from being vulgarly good-natured and restlessly witty. She knew how to think, an accomplishment rare in women, and she had thought to very good purpose. Of course, too, she knew how to feel. Isabel couldn't have spent a week with her without being sure of that. This was indeed Madame Merle's great talent, her most perfect gift. Life had told upon her. She had felt it strongly, and it was part of the satisfaction to be taken in her society that when the girl talked of what she was pleased to call serious matters, this lady understood her so easily and quickly. Emotion, it is true, had become with her rather historic. She made no secret of the fact that the fount of passion, thanks to having been rather violently tapped at one period, didn't flow quite so freely as of yore. She proposed, moreover, as well as expected, to cease feeling. She freely admitted that of old she had been a little mad, and now she pretended to be perfectly sane. "I judge more than I used to," she said to Isabel, "but it seems to me one has earned the right. One can't judge till one's 40. Before that we're too eager, too hard, too cruel, and in addition much too ignorant. I'm sorry for you. It will be a long time before you're 40. But every gain's a loss of some kind. I often think that after 40 one can't really feel. The freshness, the quickness have certainly gone. You'll keep them longer than most people. It will be a great satisfaction to me to see you some years hence. I want to see what life makes of you. One thing's certain, it can't spoil you. It may pull you about horribly, but I defy it to break you up." Isabel received this assurance as the young soldier still panting from a slight skirmish in which he has come off with honour, might receive a pat on the shoulder from his colonel. Like such a recognition of merit, it seemed to come with authority. How could the lightest word do less on the part of a person who was prepared to say of almost everything Isabel told her, "Oh, I've been in that, my dear. It passes like everything else." On many of her interlocutors Madame Merle might have produced an irritating effect. It was disconcertingly difficult to surprise her. But Isabel, though by no means incapable of desiring to be effective, had not at present this impulse. She was too sincere, too interested in her judicious companion. And then, moreover, Madame Merle never said such things in the tone of triumph or boastfulness. They dropped from her like cold confessions. A period of bad weather had settled upon Gardencourt. The days grew shorter, and there was an end to the pretty tea parties on the lawn. But our young woman had long indoor conversations with her fellow visitor, and in spite of the rain the two ladies often sallied forth for a walk, equipped with a defensive apparatus which the English climate and the English genius have between them brought to such perfection. Madame Merle liked almost everything, including the English rain. "There's always a little of it, and never too much at once," she said, "and it never wets you, and it always smells good." She declared that in England the pleasures of smell were great, that in this inimitable island there was a certain mixture of fog and beer and soot, which, however odd it might sound, was the national aroma, and was most agreeable to the nostril; and she used to lift the sleeve of her British overcoat and bury her nose in it, inhaling the clear, fine scent of the wool. Poor Ralph Touchett, as soon as the autumn had begun to define itself, became almost a prisoner. In bad weather he was unable to step out of the house, and he used sometimes to stand at one of the windows with his hands in his pockets, and from a countenance half rueful, half critical, watch Isabel and Madame Merle as they walked down the avenue under a pair of umbrellas. The roads about Gardencourt were so firm, even in the worst weather, that the two ladies always came back with a healthy glow in their cheeks, looking at the soles of their neat, stout boots, and declaring that their walk had done them inexpressible good. Before luncheon, always, Madame Merle was engaged. Isabel admired and envied her rigid possession of her morning. Our heroine had always passed for a person of resources, and had taken a certain pride in being one. But she wandered, as by the wrong side of the wall of a private garden, round the enclosed talents, accomplishments, aptitudes of Madame Merle. She found herself desiring to emulate them, and in 20 such ways this lady presented herself as a model. "I should like awfully to be so," Isabel secretly exclaimed more than once, as one after another of her friend's fine aspects caught the light; and before long she knew that she had learned a lesson from a high authority. It took no time indeed for her to feel herself, as the phrase is, under an influence. What's the harm, she wondered, so long as it's a good one? The more one's under a good influence, the better. The only thing is to see our steps as we take them, to understand them as we go. That, no doubt, I shall always do. I needn't be afraid of becoming too pliable. Isn't it my fault that I'm not pliable enough? It is said that imitation is the sincerest flattery, and if Isabel was sometimes moved to gape at her friend aspiringly and despairingly, it was not so much because she desired herself to shine as because she wished to hold up the lamp for Madame Merle. She liked her extremely, but was even more dazzled than attracted. She sometimes asked herself what Henrietta Stackpole would say to her thinking so much of this perverted product of their common soil, and had a conviction that it would be severely judged. Henrietta would not at all subscribe to Madame Merle. For reasons she could not have defined, this truth came home to the girl. On the other hand, she was equally sure that, should the occasion offer, Her new friend would strike off some happy view of her old. Madame Merle was too humorous, too observant, not to do justice to Henrietta, and on becoming acquainted with her would probably give the measure of a tact which Miss Stackpole couldn't hope to emulate. She appeared to have in her experience a touchstone for everything, and somewhere in the capacious pocket of her genial memory she would find the key to Henrietta's value. "That's the great thing," Isabel solemnly pondered. "That's the supreme good fortune: to be in a better position for appreciating people than they are for appreciating you." And she added that such, when one considered it, was simply the essence of the aristocratic situation. In this light, if in none other, one should aim at the aristocratic situation. I may not count over all the links in the chain which led Isabel to think of Madame Merle's situation as aristocratic, a view of it never expressed in any reference made to it by that lady herself. She had known great things and great people, but she had never played a great part. She was one of the small ones of the earth. She had not been born to honours. She knew the world too well to nourish fatuous illusions on the article of her own place in it. She had encountered many of the fortunate few, and was perfectly aware of those points at which their fortune differed from hers. But if, by her informed measure, she was no figure for a high scene, she had yet, to Isabel's imagination, a sort of greatness. To be so cultivated and civilised, so wise and so easy, and still make so light of it, that was really to be a great lady, especially when one so carried and presented oneself. It was as if somehow she had all society under contribution, and all the arts and graces it practised, or was the effect rather that of charming uses found for her, even from a distance, subtle service rendered by her to a clamorous world wherever she might be? After breakfast she wrote a succession of letters, as those arriving for her appeared innumerable. Her correspondence was a source of surprise to Isabel when they sometimes walked together to the village post office to deposit Madame Merle's offering to the mail. She knew more people, as she told Isabel, than she knew what to do with, and something was always turning up to be written about. Of painting she was devotedly fond, and made no more of brushing in a sketch than of pulling off her gloves. At Gardencourt she was perpetually taking advantage of an hour's sunshine to go out with a camp stool and a box of water-colours. That she was a brave musician we have already perceived, and it was evidence of the fact that when she seated herself at the piano, as she always did in the evening, her listeners resigned themselves without a murmur to losing the grace of her talk. Isabel, since she had known her, felt ashamed of her own facility, which she now looked upon as basely inferior; and indeed, though she had been thought rather a prodigy at home, the loss to society when, in taking her place upon the music stool, she turned her back to the room, was usually deemed greater than the gain. When Madame Merle was neither writing nor painting nor touching the piano, she was usually employed upon wonderful tasks of rich embroidery, cushions, curtains, decorations for the chimney-piece, an art in which her bold, free invention was as noted as the agility of her needle. She was never idle, for when engaged in none of the ways I have mentioned, she was either reading (she appeared to Isabel to read everything important), or walking out, or playing patience with the cards, or talking with her fellow inmates; and with all this she had always the social quality, was never rudely absent, and yet never two-seated. She laid down her pastimes as easily as she took them up. She worked and talked at the same time, and appeared to impute scant worth to anything she did. She gave away her sketches and tapestries. She rose from the piano, or remained there, according to the convenience of her auditors, which she always unerringly divined. She was, in short, the most comfortable, profitable, amenable person to live with. If for Isabel she had a fault, it was that she was not natural; by which the girl meant, not that she was either affected or pretentious, since from these vulgar vices no woman could have been more exempt; but that her nature had been too much overlaid by custom and her angles too much rubbed away. She had become too flexible, too useful, was too ripe and too final. She was, in a word, too perfectly the social animal that man and woman are supposed to have been intended to be, and she had rid herself of every remnant of that tonic wildness which we may assume to have belonged even to the most amiable persons in the ages before country house life was the fashion. Isabel found it difficult to think of her in any detachment or privacy. She existed only in her relations, direct or indirect, with her fellow mortals. One might wonder what commerce she could possibly hold with her own spirit. One always ended, however, by feeling that a charming surface doesn't necessarily prove one superficial. This was an illusion in which, in one's youth, one had but just escaped being nourished. Madame Merle was not superficial, not she. She was deep, and her nature spoke none the less in her behaviour because it spoke a conventional tongue. "What's language at all but a convention?" said Isabel. "She has the good taste not to pretend, like some people I've met, to express herself by original signs." "I'm afraid you've suffered much," she once found occasion to say to her friend in response to some allusion which had appeared to reach far. "What makes you think that?" Madame Merle asked with the amused smile of a person seated at a game of guesses. "I hope I haven't too much the droop of the misunderstood." "No, but you sometimes say things that I think people who have always been happy wouldn't have found out." "I haven't always been happy," said Madame Merle, smiling still, but with a mock gravity, as if she were telling a child a secret. "Such a wonderful thing!" But Isabel rose to the irony. "A great many people give me the impression of never having for a moment felt anything." "It's very true. There are many more iron pots, certainly, than porcelain. But you may depend on it that every one bears some mark. Even the hardest iron pots have a little bruise, a little hole somewhere. I flatter myself that I'm rather stout, but if I must tell you the truth, I've been shockingly chipped and cracked. I do very well for service yet because I've been cleverly mended, and I try to remain in the cupboard, the quiet, dusky cupboard where there's an odour of stale spices, as much as I can. But when I've to come out and into a strong light, then, my dear, I'm a horror." I know not whether it was on this occasion or on some other that when the conversation had taken the turn I have just indicated, she said to Isabel that she would some day a tale unfold. Isabel assured her she should delight to listen to one, and reminded her more than once of this engagement. Madame Merle, however, begged repeatedly for a respite, and at last frankly told her young companion that they must wait till they knew each other better. This would be sure to happen; a long friendship so visibly lay before them. Isabel assented, but at the same time inquired if she mightn't be trusted, if she appeared capable of a betrayal of confidence. "It's not that I'm afraid of your repeating what I say," her fellow visitor answered. "I'm afraid, on the contrary, of your taking it too much to yourself. You judge me too harshly. You're of the cruel age." She preferred for the present to talk to Isabel of Isabel, and exhibited the greatest interest in our heroine's history, sentiments, opinions, prospects. She made her chatter and listened to her chatter with infinite good nature. This flattered and quickened the girl, who was struck with all the distinguished people her friend had known, and with her having lived, as Mrs. Touchett said, in the best company in Europe. Isabel thought the better of herself for enjoying the favour of a person who had so large a field of comparison, and it was perhaps partly to gratify the sense of profiting by comparison that she often appealed to these stores of reminiscence. Madame Merle had been a dweller in many lands, and had social ties in a dozen different countries. "I don't pretend to be educated," she would say, "but I think I know my Europe;" and she spoke one day of going to Sweden to stay with an old friend, and another of proceeding to Malta to follow up a new acquaintance. With England, where she had often dwelt, she was thoroughly familiar, and for Isabel's benefit threw a great deal of light upon the customs of the country and the character of the people who, after all, as she was fond of saying, were the most convenient in the world to live with. "You mustn't think it strange her remaining here at such a time as this, when Mr. Touchett's passing away," that gentleman's wife remarked to her niece. "She is incapable of a mistake. She's the most tactful woman I know. It's a favour to me that she stays. She's putting off a lot of visits at great houses," said Mrs. Touchett, who never forgot that when she herself was in England her social value sank 2 or 3 degrees in the scale. "She has her pick of places. She's not in want of a shelter. But I've asked her to put in this time because I wish you to know her. I think it will be a good thing for you. Serena Male hasn't a fault." "If I didn't already like her very much, that description might alarm me," Isabel returned. "She's never the least bit off. I've brought you out here, and I wish to do the best for you. Your sister Lily told me she hoped I would give you plenty of opportunities. I give you one in putting you in relation with Madame Merle. She's one of the most brilliant women in Europe." "I like her better than I like your description of her," Isabel persisted in saying. "Do you flatter yourself that you'll ever feel her open to criticism? I hope you'll let me know when you do." "That will be cruel to you," said Isabel. "You needn't mind me. You won't discover a fault in her." "Perhaps not, but I dare say I shan't miss it." "She knows absolutely everything on earth there is to know," said Mrs. Touchett. Isabel after this observed to their companion that she hoped she knew Mrs. Touchett considered she hadn't a speck on her perfection. On which, "I'm obliged to you," Madame Merle replied, "but I'm afraid your aunt imagines, or at least alludes to, no aberrations that the clock face doesn't register." "So that you mean you've had a wild side that's unknown to her?" "Ah, no. I fear my darkest sides are my tamest. I mean that having no faults for your aunt means that one's never late for dinner. That is, for her dinner. I was not late, by the way, the other day when you came back from London. The clock was just at 8 when I came into the drawing room. It was the rest of you that were there before the time. It means that one answers a letter the day one gets it, and that when one comes to stay with her one doesn't bring too much luggage and is careful not to be taken ill. For Mrs. Touchett those things constitute virtue. It's a blessing to be able to reduce it to its elements." Madame Merle's own conversation, it will be perceived, was enriched with bold, free touches of criticism, which, even when they had a restrictive effect, never struck Isabel as ill-natured. It couldn't occur to the girl, for instance, that Mrs. Touchett's accomplished guest was abusing her, and this for very good reasons. In the first place, Isabel rose eagerly to the sense of her shades. In the second, Madame Merle implied that there was a great deal more to say, and it was clear in the third that for a person to speak to one without ceremony of one's near relations was an agreeable sign of that person's intimacy with one's self. These signs of deep communion multiplied as the days elapsed, and there was none of which Isabel was more sensible than of her companion's preference for making Miss Archer herself a topic. Though she referred frequently to the incidents of her own career, she never lingered upon them. She was as little of a gross egotist as she was of a flat gossip. "I'm old and stale and faded," she said more than once. "I'm of no more interest than last week's newspaper. You're young and fresh and of to day. You've the great thing. You've actuality. I once had it. We all have it for an hour. You, however, will have it for longer. Let us talk about you, then. You can say nothing I shall not care to hear. It's a sign that I'm growing old, that I like to talk with younger people. I think it's a very pretty compensation. If we can't have youth within us we can have it outside, and I really think we see it and feel it better that way. Of course we must be in sympathy with it. That I shall always be. I don't know that I shall ever be ill-natured with old people. I hope not. There are certainly some old people I adore. But I shall never be anything but abject with the young. They touch me and appeal to me too much. I give you carte blanche, then. You can even be impertinent if you like. I shall let it pass and horribly spoil you. I speak as if I were 100 years old, you say? Well, I am, if you please. I was born before the French Revolution. Ah, my dear, je viens de loin. I belong to the old, old world. But it's not of that I want to talk. I want to talk about the new. You must tell me more about America. You never tell me enough. Here I've been since I was brought here as a helpless child, and it's ridiculous, or rather it's scandalous, how little I know about that splendid, dreadful, funny country, surely the greatest and drollest of them all. There are a great many of us like that in these parts, and I must say I think we're a wretched set of people. You should live in your own land. Whatever it may be, you have your natural place there. If we're not good Americans, we're certainly poor Europeans. We have no natural place here. We're mere parasites, crawling over the surface. We haven't our feet in the soil. At least one can know it and not have illusions. A woman perhaps can get on. A woman, it seems to me, has no natural place anywhere. Wherever she finds herself she has to remain on the surface and more or less to crawl. You protest, my dear? You're horrified? You declare you'll never crawl? It's very true that I don't see you crawling. You stand more upright than a good many poor creatures. Very good. On the whole, I don't think you'll crawl. But the men, the Americans, je vous demande un peu, what do they make of it over here? I don't envy them trying to arrange themselves. Look at poor Ralph Touchett. What sort of a figure do you call that? Fortunately he has a consumption. I say fortunately because it gives him something to do. His consumption's his carrière. It's a kind of position. You can say, oh, Mr. Touchett, he takes care of his lungs. He knows a great deal about climates. But without that, who would he be? What would he represent? Mr. Ralph Touchett, an American who lives in Europe. That signifies absolutely nothing. It's impossible anything should signify less. He's very cultivated, they say. He has a very pretty collection of old snuff-boxes. The collection is all that's wanted to make it pitiful. I'm tired of the sound of the word. I think it's grotesque. With the poor old father it's different. He has his identity, and it's rather a massive one. He represents a great financial house, and that, in our day, is as good as anything else. For an American, at any rate, that will do very well. But I persist in thinking your cousin very lucky to have a chronic malady so long as he doesn't die of it. It's much better than the snuff-boxes. If he weren't ill, you say, he'd do something? He'd take his father's place in the house? My poor child, I doubt it. I don't think he's at all fond of the house. However, you know him better than I, though I used to know him rather well, and he may have the benefit of the doubt. The worst case, I think, is a friend of mine, a countryman of ours, who lives in Italy, where he was also brought before he knew better, and who is one of the most delightful men I know. Some day you must know him. I'll bring you together, and then you'll see what I mean. He's Gilbert Osmond. He lives in Italy. That's all one can say about him or make of him. He's exceedingly clever, a man made to be distinguished. But, as I tell you, you exhaust the description when you say he's Mr. Osmond who lives tout bêtement in Italy. No career, no name, no position, no fortune, no past, no future, no anything. Oh yes, he paints, if you please, paints in watercolours, like me, only better than I. His painting's pretty bad. On the whole, I'm rather glad of that. Fortunately, he's very indolent, so indolent that it amounts to a sort of position. He can say, "Oh, I do nothing. I'm too deadly lazy. You can do nothing to day unless you get up at 5 o'clock in the morning." In that way he becomes a sort of exception. You feel he might do something if he'd only rise early. He never speaks of his painting to people at large, he's too clever for that. But he has a little girl, a dear little girl, he does speak of her. He's devoted to her, and if it were a career to be an excellent father he'd be very distinguished. But I'm afraid that's no better than the snuff boxes, perhaps not even so good. Tell me what they do in America," pursued Madame Merle, who, it must be observed parenthetically, did not deliver herself all at once of these reflections, which are presented in a cluster for the convenience of the reader. She talked of Florence, where Mr. Osmond lived, and where Mrs. Touchett occupied a mediaeval palace. She talked of Rome, where she herself had a little pied-à-terre with some rather good old damask. She talked of places, of people, and even, as the phrase is, of subjects, and from time to time she talked of their kind old host and of the prospect of his recovery. From the first she had thought this prospect small, and Isabel had been struck with the positive, discriminating, competent way in which he took the measure of his remainder of life. One evening she announced definitely that he wouldn't live. "Sir Matthew Hope told me so as plainly as was proper," she said, "standing there, near the fire before dinner. He makes himself very agreeable, the great doctor. I don't mean his saying that has anything to do with it, but he says such things with great tact. I had told him I felt ill at my ease, staying here at such a time. It seemed to me so indiscreet. It wasn't as if I could nurse. 'You must remain, he answered. "Your office will come later." Wasn't that a very delicate way of saying both that poor Mr. Touchett would go, and that I might be of some use as a consoler? In fact, however, I shall not be of the slightest use. Your aunt will console herself. She, and she alone, knows just how much consolation she'll require. It would be a very delicate matter for another person to undertake to administer the dose. With your cousin it will be different. He'll miss his father immensely. But I should never presume to condole with Mr. Ralph. We're not on those terms." Madame Merle had alluded more than once to some undefined incongruity in her relations with Ralph Touchett, so Isabel took this occasion of asking her if they were not good friends. "Perfectly, but he doesn't like me." "What have you done to him?" "Nothing whatever, but one has no need of a reason for that." "For not liking you? I think one has need of a very good reason." "You're very kind. Be sure you have one ready for the day you begin." "Begin to dislike you? I shall never begin." "I hope not, because if you do you'll never end. That's the way with your cousin. He doesn't get over it. It's an antipathy of nature, if I can call it that when it's all on his side. I've nothing whatever against him, and don't bear him the least little grudge for not doing me justice. Justice is all I want. However, one feels that he's a gentleman and would never say anything underhand about one. Carte sur table, Madame Merle subjoined in a moment. I'm not afraid of him." "I hope not indeed," said Isabel, who added something about his being the kindest creature living. She remembered, however, that on her first asking him about Madame Merle, he had answered her in a manner which this lady might have thought injurious without being explicit. There was something between them, Isabel said to herself, but she said nothing more than this. If it were something of importance, it should inspire respect. If it were not, it was not worth her curiosity. With all her love of knowledge, she had a natural shrinking from raising curtains and looking into unlighted corners. The love of knowledge coexisted in her mind with the finest capacity for ignorance. But Madame Merle sometimes said things that startled her, made her raise her clear eyebrows at the time and think of the words afterwards. "I'd give a great deal to be your age again," she broke out once with a bitterness which, though diluted in her customary amplitude of ease, was imperfectly disguised by it. "If I could only begin again! If I could have my life before me!" "Your life's before you yet," Isabel answered gently, for she was vaguely awestruck. "No, the best part's gone, and gone for nothing." "Surely not for nothing," said Isabel. "Why not? What have I got? Neither husband nor child, nor fortune nor position, nor the traces of a beauty that I never had." "You have many friends, dear lady." "I'm not so sure," cried Madame Merle. "Ah, you're wrong. You have memories, graces, talents." But Madame Merle interrupted her. "What have my talents brought me? Nothing but the need of using them still, to get through the hours, the years, to cheat myself with some pretence of movement, of unconsciousness. As for my graces and memories, the less said about them the better. You'll be my friend till you find a better use for your friendship." "It will be for you to see that I don't, then," said Isabel. "Yes, I would make an effort to keep you." And her companion looked at her gravely. "When I say that I should like to be your age, I mean with your qualities frank, generous, sincere, like you. In that case I should have made something better of my life." "What should you have liked to do that you've not done?" Madame Merle took a sheet of music. She was seated at the piano and had abruptly wheeled about on the stool when she first spoke, and mechanically turned the leaves. "I'm very ambitious," she at last replied. "And your ambitions have not been satisfied? They must have been great." "They were great. I should make myself ridiculous by talking of them." Isabel wondered what they could have been, whether Madame Merle had aspired to wear a crown. "I don't know what your idea of success may be, but you seem to me to have been successful. To me, indeed, you're a vivid image of success." Madame Merle tossed away the music with a smile. "What's your idea of success?" "You evidently think it must be a very tame one. It's to see some dream of one's youth come true." "Ah!" Madame Merle exclaimed, "that I've never seen. But my dreams were so great, so preposterous. Heaven forgive me, I'm dreaming now." And she turned back to the piano and began grandly to play. On the morrow she said to Isabel that her definition of success had been very pretty, yet frightfully sad. Measured in that way, who had ever succeeded? The dreams of one's youth, why, they were enchanting, they were divine. Who had ever seen such things come to pass? "I myself, a few of them," Isabel ventured to answer. "Already? They must have been dreams of yesterday." "I began to dream very young," Isabel smiled. "Ah, if you mean the aspirations of your childhood, that of having a pink sash and a doll that could close her eyes." "No, I don't mean that." "Or a young man with a fine moustache going down on his knees to you?" "No, nor that either," Isabel declared with still more emphasis. Madame Merle appeared to note this eagerness. "I suspect that's what you do mean. We've all had the young man with the moustache. He's the inevitable young man. He doesn't count." Isabel was silent a little, but then spoke with extreme and characteristic inconsequence. "Why shouldn't he count? There are young men and young men." "And yours was a paragon? Is that what you mean?" asked her friend with a laugh. "If you've had the identical young man you dreamed of, then that was success, and I congratulate you with all my heart. Only in that case, why didn't you fly with him to his castle in the Apennines?" "He has no castle in the Apennines." "What has he? An ugly brick house in 40th Street? Don't tell me that. I refuse to recognize that as an ideal." "I don't care anything about his house," said Isabel. "That's very crude of you. When you've lived as long as I, you'll see that every human being has his shell, and that you must take the shell into account. By the shell I mean the whole envelope of circumstances. There's no such thing as an isolated man or woman. We're each of us made up of some cluster of appurtenances. What shall we call our self? Where does it begin? Where does it end? It overflows into everything that belongs to us, and then it flows back again. I know a large part of myself is in the clothes I choose to wear. I've a great respect for things. One's self, for other people, is one's expression of oneself, and one's house, one's furniture, one's garments, the books one reads, the company one keeps, these things are all expressive. This was very metaphysical, not more so, however, than several observations Madame Merle had already made. Isabel was fond of metaphysics, but was unable to accompany her friend into this bold analysis of the human personality. "I don't agree with you. I think just the other way. I don't know whether I succeed in expressing myself, but I know that nothing else expresses me. Nothing that belongs to me is any measure of me. Everything's on the contrary a limit, a barrier, and a perfectly arbitrary one. Certainly the clothes which, as you say, I choose to wear don't express me, and heaven forbid they should." "You dress very well," Madame Merle lightly interposed. "Possibly, but I don't care to be judged by that. My clothes may express the dressmaker, but they don't express me. To begin with, it's not my own choice that I wear them. They're imposed upon me by society." "Should you prefer to go without them?" Madame Merle inquired, in a tone which virtually terminated the discussion. I am bound to confess, though it may cast some discredit on the sketch I have given of the youthful loyalty practised by our heroine toward this accomplished woman, that Isabel had said nothing whatever to her about Lord Warburton, and had been equally reticent on the subject of Caspar Goodwood. She had not, however, concealed the fact that she had had opportunities of marrying, and had even let her friend know of how advantageous a kind they had been. Lord Warburton had left Lockleigh and was gone to Scotland, taking his sisters with him; and though he had written to Ralph more than once to ask about Mr. Touchett's health, the girl was not liable to be the embarrassment of such enquiries as, had he still been in the neighbourhood, he would probably have felt bound to make in person. He had excellent ways, but she felt sure that if he had come to Gardencourt he would have seen Madame Merle, and that if he had seen her he would have liked her, and betrayed to her that he was in love with her young friend. It so happened that during this lady's previous visits to Gardencourt, each of them much shorter than the present, he had either not been at Lockleigh or had not called at Mr. Touchett's. Therefore, though she knew him by name as the great man of that county, she had no cause to suspect him as a suitor of Mrs. Touchett's freshly imported niece. "You've plenty of time," she had said to Isabel in return for the mutilated confidences which our young woman made her, and which didn't pretend to be perfect, though we have seen that at moments the girl had compunctions at having said so much. "I'm glad you've done nothing yet, that you have it still to do. It's a very good thing for a girl to have refused a few good offers, so long, of course, as they're not the best she's likely to have. Pardon me if my tone seems horribly corrupt. One must take the worldly view sometimes. Only don't keep on refusing for the sake of refusing. It's a pleasant exercise of power, but accepting's after all an exercise of power as well. There's always the danger of refusing once too often. It was not the one I fell into. I didn't refuse often enough. You're an exquisite creature, and I should like to see you married to a Prime Minister. But speaking strictly, you know, you're not what is technically called a parti. You're extremely good-looking and extremely clever. In yourself you're quite exceptional. You appear to have the vaguest ideas about your earthly possessions, but from what I can make out you're not embarrassed with an income. I wish you had a little money." "I wish I had," said Isabel, simply, apparently forgetting for the moment that her poverty had been a venial fault for two gallant gentlemen. In spite of Sir Matthew Hope's benevolent recommendation, Madame Merle did not remain to the end, as the issue of poor Mr. Touchett's malady had now come frankly to be designated. She was under pledges to other people which had at last to be redeemed, and she left Gardencourt with the understanding that she should in any event see Mrs. Touchett there again, or else in town, before quitting England. Her parting with Isabel was even more like the beginning of a friendship than their meeting had been. I'm going to 6 places in succession, but I shall see no one I like so well as you. They'll all be old friends, however. One doesn't make new friends at my age. I've made a great exception for you. You must remember that, and must think as well of me as possible. You must reward me by believing in me." By way of answer Isabel kissed her, and though some women kiss with facility, there are kisses and kisses, and this embrace was satisfactory to Madame Merle. Our young lady after this was much alone. She saw her aunt and cousin only at meals, and discovered that of the hours during which Mrs. Touchett was invisible, only a minor portion was now devoted to nursing her husband. She spent the rest in her own apartments, to which access was not allowed even to her niece, apparently occupied there with mysterious and inscrutable exercises. At table she was grave and silent, but her solemnity was not an attitude. Isabel could see it was a conviction. She wondered if her aunt repented of having taken her own way so much, but there was no visible evidence of this, no tears, no sighs, no exaggeration of a zeal always to its own sense adequate. Mrs. Touchett seemed simply to feel the need of thinking things over and summing them up. She had a little moral account book, with columns unerringly ruled and a sharp steel clasp, which she kept with exemplary neatness. Uttered reflection had with her ever, at any rate, a practical ring. "If I had foreseen this, I'd not have proposed your coming abroad now," she said to Isabel, after Madame Merle had left the house. "I'd have waited and sent for you next year." "So that perhaps I should never have known my uncle? It's a great happiness to me to have come now." "That's very well, but it was not that you might know your uncle that I brought you to Europe." A perfectly veracious speech, but, as Isabel thought, not as perfectly timed. She had leisure to think of this and other matters. She took a solitary walk every day and spent vague hours in turning over books in the library. Among the subjects that engaged her attention were the adventures of her friend, Miss Stackpole, with whom she was in regular correspondence. Isabel liked her friend's private epistolary style better than her public. That is, she felt her public letters would have been excellent if they had not been printed. Henrietta's career, however, was not so successful as might have been wished even in the interest of her private felicity. That view of the inner life of Great Britain, which she was so eager to take, appeared to dance before her like an ignis fatuus. The invitation from Lady Pensel, for mysterious reasons, had never arrived, and poor Mr. Bantling himself, with all his friendly ingenuity, had been unable to explain so grave a dereliction on the part of a missive that had obviously been sent. He had evidently taken Henrietta's affairs much to heart, and believed that he owed her a set-off to this illusory visit to Bedfordshire. "He says he should think I would go to the Continent," Henrietta wrote, "and as he thinks of going there himself, I suppose his advice is sincere. He wants to know why I don't take a view of French life, and it's a fact that I want very much to see the new Republic. Mr. Bantling doesn't care much about the Republic, but he thinks of going over to Paris anyway. I must say he's quite as attentive as I could wish, and at least I shall have seen one polite Englishman. I keep telling Mr. Bantling that he ought to have been an American, and you should see how that pleases him. Whenever I say so, he always breaks out with the same exclamation, 'Ah, but really, come now!'" A few days later she wrote that she had decided to go to Paris at the end of the week, and that Mr. Bantling had promised to see her off, perhaps even would go as far as Dover with her. She would wait in Paris till Isabel should arrive, Henrietta added, speaking quite as if Isabel were to start on her continental journey alone, and making no allusion to Mrs. Touchett. Bearing in mind his interest in their late companion, our heroine communicated several passages from this correspondence to Ralph, who followed with an emotion akin to suspense the career of the representative of the interviewer. "It seems to me she's doing very well," he said, "going over to Paris with an ex-lancer. If she wants something to write about, she has only to describe that episode." "It's not conventional, certainly," Isabel answered. "But if you mean that, as far as Henrietta is concerned, it's not perfectly innocent, you're very much mistaken. You'll never understand Henrietta." "Pardon me, I understand her perfectly. I didn't at all at first, but now I've the point of view. I'm afraid, however, that Bantling hasn't. He may have some surprises. Oh, I understand Henrietta as well as if I had made her." Isabel was by no means sure of this, but she abstained from expressing further doubt, for she was disposed in these days to extend a great charity to her cousin. One afternoon, less than a week after Madame Merle's departure, she was seated in the library with a volume to which her attention was not fastened. She had placed herself in a deep window bench, from which she looked out into the dull, damp park, and as the library stood at right angles to the entrance front of the house, she could see the doctor's brougham, which had been waiting for the last 2 hours before the door. She was struck with his remaining so long, but at last she saw him appear in the portico, stand a moment slowly, drawing on his gloves and looking at the knees of his horse, and then get into the vehicle and roll away. Isabel kept her place for half an hour. There was a great stillness in the house. It was so great that when she at last heard a soft, slow step on the deep carpet of the room, she was almost startled by the sound. She turned quickly away from the window and saw Ralph Touchett standing there with his hands still in his pockets, but with a face absolutely void of its usual latent smile. She got up, and her movement and glance were a question. "It's all over," said Ralph. "Do you mean that my uncle—" and Isabel stopped. "My dear father died an hour ago." "Ah, my poor Ralph!" she gently wailed, putting out her 2 hands to him. Chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Portrait of a Lady by Henry James. This recording is in the public domain. Some fortnight after this, Madame Merle drove up in a hansom cab to the house in Winchester Square. As she descended from her vehicle, she observed, suspended between the dining room windows, a large, neat wooden tablet, on whose fresh black ground were inscribed in white paint the words, "This noble freehold mansion to be sold," with the name of the agent to whom application should be made. "They certainly lose no time," said the visitor, as after sounding the big brass knocker she waited to be admitted. "It's a practical country." And within the house, as she ascended to the drawing room, she perceived numerous signs of abdication, pictures removed from the walls and placed upon sofas, windows undraped and floors laid bare. Mrs. Touchett presently received her and intimated in a few words that condolences might be taken for granted. "I know what you're going to say. He was a very good man. But I know it better than any one, because I gave him more chance to show it. In that I think I was a good wife." Mrs. Touchett added that at the end her husband apparently recognised this fact. "He has treated me most liberally," she said. "I won't say more liberally than I expected, because I didn't expect. You know that as a general thing I don't expect. But he chose, I presume, to recognise the fact that though I lived much abroad and mingled, you may say freely, in foreign life, I never exhibited the smallest preference for any one else." "For any one but yourself," Madame Merle mentally observed, but the reflection was perfectly inaudible. "I never sacrificed my husband to another," Mrs. Touchett continued with her stout curtness. "Oh no," thought Madame Merle, "you never did anything for another." There was a certain cynicism in these mute comments which demands an explanation, the more so as they are not in accord either with the view, somewhat superficial perhaps, that we have hitherto enjoyed of Madame Merle's character, or with the literal facts of Mrs. Touchett's history. The more so, too, as Madame Merle had a well-founded conviction that her friend's last remark was not in the least to be construed as a side-thrust at herself. The truth is that the moment she had crossed the threshold she received an impression that Mr. Touchett's death had had subtle consequences, and that these consequences had been profitable to a little circle of persons among whom she was not numbered. Of course it was an event which would naturally have consequences. Her imagination had more than once rested upon this fact during her stay at Gardencourt. But it had been one thing to foresee such a matter mentally, and another to stand among its massive records. The idea of a distribution of property, she would almost have said of spoils, just now pressed upon her senses and irritated her with a sense of exclusion. I am far from wishing to picture her as one of the hungry mouths or envious hearts of the general herd, but we have already learned of her having desires that had never been satisfied. If she had been questioned she would of course have admitted, with a fine proud smile, that she had not the faintest claim to a share in Mr. Touchett's relics. "There was never anything in the world between us," she would have said. "There was never that, poor man," with a fillip of her thumb and her third finger. I hasten to add, moreover, that if she couldn't at the present moment keep from quite perversely yearning, she was careful not to betray herself. She had, after all, as much sympathy for Mrs. Touchett's gain as for her losses. "He has left me this house," the newly made widow said, "but of course I shall not live in it. I've a much better one in Florence. The will was opened only 3 days since, but I've already offered the house for sale. I've also a share in the bank, but I don't yet understand if I'm obliged to leave it there. If not, I shall certainly take it out. Ralph, of course, has Gardencourt, but I'm not sure he'll have the means to keep up the place. He's naturally left very well off, but his father has given away an immense deal of money. There are bequests to a string of third cousins in Vermont. Ralph, however, is very fond of Gardencourt, and would be quite capable of living there, in summer, with a maid of all work and a gardener's boy. There's one remarkable clause in my husband's will," Mrs. Touchett added. "He has left my niece a fortune." "A fortune?" Madame Merle softly repeated. "Isabel steps into something like £70,000." Madame Merle's hands were clasped in her lap. At this she raised them, still clasped, and held them a moment against her bosom, while her eyes, a little dilated, fixed themselves on those of her friend. "Ah!" she cried, "the clever creature!" Mrs. Touchett gave her a quick look. "What do you mean by that?" For an instant Madame Merle's colour rose, and she dropped her eyes. "It certainly is clever to achieve such results without an effort." "There assuredly was no effort. Don't call it an achievement." Madame Merle was seldom guilty of the awkwardness of retracting what she had said. Her wisdom was shown rather in maintaining it and placing it in a favourable light. "My dear friend, Isabel would certainly not have had £70,000 left her if she had not been the most charming girl in the world. Her charm includes great cleverness." "She never dreamed, I'm sure, of my husband's doing anything for her, and I never dreamed of it either, for he never spoke to me of his intention," Mrs. Touchett said. "She had no claim upon him whatever. It was no great recommendation to him that she was my niece. Whatever she achieved unconsciously." "Ah!" rejoined Madame Merle, "those are the greatest strokes." Mrs. Touchett reserved her opinion. "The girl's fortunate, I don't deny that, but for the present she's simply stupefied." "Do you mean that she doesn't know what to do with the money?" "That, I think, she has hardly considered. She doesn't know what to think about the matter at all. It has been as if a big gun were suddenly fired off behind her. She's feeling herself to see if she can be hurt. It's but 3 days since she received a visit from the principal executor, who came in person, very gallantly, to notify her. He told me afterwards that when he made his little speech she suddenly burst into tears. The money's to remain in the affairs of the bank, and she's to draw the interest." Madame Merle shook her head with a wise and now quite benignant smile. "How very delicious! After she has done that 2 or 3 times she'll get used to it." Then, after a silence, "What does your son think of it?" she abruptly asked. "He left England before the will was read, used up by his fatigue and anxiety, and hurrying off to the south. He's on his way to the Riviera, and I've not yet heard from him, but it's not likely he'll ever object to anything done by his father." "Didn't you say his own share had been cut down?" "Only at his wish. I know that he urged his father to do something for the people in America. He's not in the least addicted to looking after Number One." "It depends upon whom he regards as Number One," said Madame Merle. And she remained thoughtful a moment, her eyes bent on the floor. "Am I not to see your happy niece?" she asked at last as she raised them. "You may see her, but you'll not be struck with her being happy. She has looked as solemn these 3 days as a Cimabue Madonna." And Mrs. Touchett rang for a servant. Isabel came in shortly after the footman had been sent to call her, and Madame Merle thought, as she appeared, that Mrs. Touchett's comparison had its force. The girl was pale and grave, an effect not mitigated by her deeper mourning, but the smile of her brightest moments came into her face as she saw Madame Merle, who went forward, laid her hand on our heroine's shoulder, and after looking at her a moment, kissed her as if she were returning the kiss she had received from her at Gardencourt. This was the only allusion the visitor, in her great good taste, made for the present to her young friend's inheritance. Mrs. Touchett had no purpose of awaiting in London the sale of her house. After selecting from among its furniture the objects she wished to transport to her other abode, she left the rest of its contents to be disposed of by the auctioneer, and took her departure for the Continent. She was, of course, accompanied on this journey by her niece, who now had plenty of leisure to measure and weigh, and otherwise handle the windfall on which Madame Merle had covertly congratulated her. Isabel thought very often of the fact of her accession of means, looking at it in a dozen different lights, but we shall not now attempt to follow her train of thought, or to explain exactly why her new consciousness was at first oppressive. This failure to rise to immediate joy was indeed but brief. The girl presently made up her mind that to be rich was a virtue, because it was to be able to do, and that to do could only be sweet. It was the graceful contrary of the stupid side of weakness, especially the feminine variety. To be weak was, for a delicate young person, rather graceful, but after all, as Isabel said to herself, there was a larger grace than that. Just now, it is true, there was not much to do. Once she had sent off a cheque to Lily and another to poor Edith. But she was thankful for the quiet months which her mourning robes and her aunt's fresh widowhood compelled them to spend together. The acquisition of power made her serious. She scrutinized her power with a kind of tender ferocity, but was not eager to exercise it. She began to do so during a stay of some weeks, which she eventually made with her aunt in Paris, though in ways that will inevitably present themselves as trivial. They were the ways most naturally imposed in a city in which the shops are the admiration of the world, and that were prescribed unreservedly by the guidance of Mrs. Touchett, who took a rigidly practical view of the transformation of her niece from a poor girl to a rich one. "Now that you're a young woman of fortune, you must know how to play the part. I mean, to play it well," she said to Isabel once for all. And she added that the girl's first duty was to have everything handsome. "You don't know how to take care of your things, but you must learn," she went on. This was Isabel's second duty. Isabel submitted, but for the present her imagination was not kindled. She longed for opportunities, but these were not the opportunities she meant. Mrs. Touchett rarely changed her plans, and having intended before her husband's death to spend a part of the winter in Paris, saw no reason to deprive herself, still less to deprive her companion, of this advantage. Though they would live in great retirement, she might still present her niece informally to the little circle of her fellow countrymen dwelling upon the skirts of the Champs-Élysées. With many of these amiable colonists Mrs. Touchett was intimate. She shared their expatriation, their convictions, their pastimes, their ennuis. Isabel saw them arrive with a good deal of assiduity at her aunt's hotel, and pronounced on them with a trenchancy doubtless to be accounted for by the temporary exaltation of her sense of human duty. She made up her mind that their lives were, though luxurious, inane, and incurred some disfavour by expressing this view on bright Sunday afternoons, when the American absentees were engaged in calling on each other. Though her listeners passed for people kept exemplarily genial by their cooks and dressmakers, 2 or 3 of them thought her cleverness, which was generally admitted, inferior to that of the new theatrical pieces. "You all live here this way, but what does it lead to?" she was pleased to ask. "It doesn't seem to lead to anything, and I should think you'd get very tired of it." Mrs. Touchett thought the question worthy of Henrietta Stackpole. The 2 ladies had found Henrietta in Paris, and Isabel constantly saw her; so that Mrs. Touchett had some reason for saying to herself that if her niece were not clever enough to originate almost anything, she might be suspected of having borrowed that style of remark from her journalistic friend. The first occasion on which Isabel had spoken was that of a visit paid by the 2 ladies to Mrs. Luce, an old friend of Mrs. Touchett's, and the only person in Paris she now went to see. Mrs. Luce had been living in Paris since the days of Louis Philippe. She used to say jocosely that she was one of the generation of 1830, a joke of which the point was not always taken. When it failed, Mrs. Luce used to explain, "Oh yes, I'm one of the romantics." Her French had never become quite perfect. She was always at home on Sunday afternoons and surrounded by sympathetic compatriots, usually the same. In fact, she was at home at all times, and reproduced with wondrous truth in her well-cushioned little corner of the brilliant city the domestic tone of her native Baltimore. This reduced Mr. Luce, her worthy husband, a tall, lean, grizzled, well-brushed gentleman, who wore a gold eyeglass and carried his hat a little too much on the back of his head, to mere platonic praise of the distractions of Paris. They were his great word, since you would never have guessed from what cares he escaped to them. One of them was that he went every day to the American bankers, where he found a post office that was almost as sociable and colloquial an institution as in an American country town. He passed an hour, in fine weather, in a chair in the Champs-Élysées, and he dined uncommonly well at his own table, seated above a waxed floor which it was Mrs. Luce's happiness to believe had a finer polish than any other in the French capital. Occasionally he dined with a friend or 2 at the Café Anglais, where his talent for ordering a dinner was a source of felicity to his companions, and an object of admiration even to the head waiter of the establishment. These were his only known pastimes, but they had beguiled his hours for upwards of half a century, and they doubtless justified his frequent declaration that there was no place like Paris. In no other place, on these terms, could Mr. Luce flatter himself that he was enjoying life. There was nothing like Paris, but it must be confessed that Mr. Luce thought less highly of this scene of his dissipations than in earlier days. In the list of his resources his political reflections should not be admitted, for they were doubtless the animating principle of many hours that superficially seemed vacant. Like many of his fellow colonists, Mr. Luce was a high, or rather a deep, conservative, and gave no countenance to the government lately established in France. He had no faith in its duration, and would assure you from year to year that its end was close at hand. "They want to be kept down, sir, to be kept down. Nothing but the strong hand, the iron heel, will do for them," he would frequently say of the French people; and his ideal of a fine, showy, clever rule was that of the superseded empire. "Paris is much less attractive than in the days of the Emperor. He knew how to make a city pleasant," Mr. Luce had often remarked to Mrs. Touchett, who was quite of his own way of thinking, and wished to know what one had crossed that odious Atlantic for but to get away from republics. "Why, madam, sitting in the Champs Elysees, opposite to the Palace of Industry, I've seen the court carriages from the Tuileries pass up and down as many as 7 times a day. I remember one occasion when they went as high as 9. What do you see now? It's no use talking, the style's all gone. Napoleon knew what the French people want, and there'll be a dark cloud over Paris, our Paris, till they get the empire back again." Among Mrs. Luce's visitors on Sunday afternoons was a young man with whom Isabel had had a good deal of conversation, and whom she found full of valuable knowledge. Mr. Edward Rozier, Ned Rozier as he was called, was native to New York, and had been brought up in Paris, living there under the eye of his father, who, as it happened, had been an early and intimate friend of the late Mr. Archer. Edward Rozier remembered Isabel as a little girl. It had been his father who came to the rescue of the small Archers at the inn at Neuchâtel. He was travelling that way with the boy, and had stopped at the hotel by chance, after their bonne had gone off with the Russian prince, and when Mr. Archer's whereabouts remained for some days a mystery. Isabel remembered perfectly the neat little male child, whose hair smelt of a delicious cosmetic, and who had a bonne all his own, warranted to lose sight of him under no provocation. Isabel took a walk with the pair beside the lake, and thought little Edward as pretty as an angel, a comparison by no means conventional in her mind, for she had a very definite conception of a type of features which she supposed to be angelic, and which her new friend perfectly illustrated. A small pink face surmounted by a blue velvet bonnet, and set off by a stiff embroidered collar, had become the countenance of her childish dreams, and she had firmly believed for some time afterwards that the heavenly hosts conversed among themselves in a queer little dialect of French English, expressing the properest sentiments, as when Edward told her that he was defended by his bonne to go near the edge of the lake, and that one must always obey to one's bonne. Ned Rozier's English had improved, at least it exhibited in a less degree the French variation. His father was dead, and his bonne dismissed, but the young man still conformed to the spirit of their teaching. He never went to the edge of the lake. There was still something agreeable to the nostrils about him, and something not offensive to nobler organs. He was a very gentle and gracious youth, with what are called cultivated tastes, an acquaintance with old china, with good wine, with the bindings of books, with the Almanach de Gotha, with the best shops, the best hotels, the hours of railway trains. He could order a dinner almost as well as Mr. Luce, and it was probable that as his experience accumulated he would be a worthy successor to that gentleman, whose rather grim politics he also advocated in a soft and innocent voice. He had some charming rooms in Paris, decorated with old Spanish altar lace, the envy of his female friends, who declared that his chimney piece was better draped than the high shoulders of many a duchess. He usually, however, spent a part of every winter at Pau, and had once passed a couple of months in the United States. He took a great interest in Isabel, and remembered perfectly the walk at Neuchâtel when she would persist in going so near the edge. He seemed to recognize this same tendency in the subversive inquiry that I quoted a moment ago, and set himself to answer our heroine's question with greater urbanity than it perhaps deserved. "What does it lead to, Miss Archer? Why, Paris leads everywhere. You can't go anywhere unless you come here first. Every one that comes to Europe has to pass through. You don't mean it in that sense so much? You mean what good it does you? Well, how can you penetrate futurity? How can you tell what lies ahead? If it's a pleasant road, I don't care where it leads." "I like the road, Miss Archer. I like the dear old asphalt. You can't get tired of it. You can't if you try. You think you would, but you wouldn't. There's always something new and fresh. Take the Hôtel Drouot now. They sometimes have 3 or 4 sales a week. Where can you get such things as you can here? In spite of all they say, I maintain they're cheaper too, if you know the right places. I know plenty of places, but I keep them to myself. I'll tell you, if you like, as a particular favour, only you mustn't tell any one else. Don't you go anywhere without asking me first. I want you to promise me that. As a general thing, avoid the boulevard. There's very little to be done on the boulevard. Speaking conscientiously, sans blague, I don't believe any one knows Paris better than I. You and Mrs. Touchett must come and breakfast with me some day, and I'll show you my things. Je ne vous dis que ça. There's been a great deal of talk about London of late. It's the fashion to cry up London. But there's nothing in it. You can't do anything in London. No Louis XV, nothing of the First Empire, nothing but their eternal Queen Anne. It's good for one's bedroom, Queen Anne, for one's washing room, but it isn't proper for a salon. Do I spend my life at the auctioneer's?" Mr. Rozier pursued in answer to another question of Isabel's. "Oh no, I haven't the means. I wish I had. You think I'm a mere trifler. I can tell by the expression of your face. You've got a wonderfully expressive face. I hope you don't mind my saying that. I mean it as a kind of warning. You think I ought to do something, and so do I, so long as you leave it vague. But when you come to the point, you see you have to stop. I can't go home and be a shopkeeper. You think I'm very well fitted? Ah, Miss Archer, you overrate me. I can buy very well, but I can't sell. You should see when I sometimes try to get rid of my things. It takes much more ability to make other people buy than to buy yourself. When I think how clever they must be, the people who make me buy. Ah, no, I couldn't be a shopkeeper. I can't be a doctor. It's a repulsive business. I can't be a clergyman. I haven't got convictions. And then I can't pronounce the names right in the Bible. They're very difficult, in the Old Testament particularly. I can't be a lawyer. I don't understand, how do you call it, the American procédure. Is there anything else? There's nothing for a gentleman in America. I should like to be a diplomatist, but American diplomacy, that's not for a gentleman either. I'm sure if you had seen the last Henrietta Stackpole, who was often with her friend when Mr. Rozier, coming to pay his compliments late in the afternoon, expressed himself after the fashion I have sketched, usually interrupted the young man at this point and read him a lecture on the duties of the American citizen. She thought him most unnatural. He was worse than poor Ralph Touchett. Henrietta, however, was at this time more than ever addicted to fine criticism, for her conscience had been freshly alarmed as regards Isabel. She had not congratulated this young lady on her augmentations and begged to be excused from doing so. "If Mr. Touchett had consulted me about leaving you money," she frankly asserted, "I'd have said to him, 'Never.'" "I see," Isabel had answered. "You think it will prove a curse in disguise. Perhaps it will." "Leave it to some one you care less for. That's what I should have said." "To yourself, for instance?" Isabel suggested jocosely. And then, "Do you really believe it will ruin me?" she asked in quite another tone. "I hope it won't ruin you, but it will certainly confirm your dangerous tendencies." "Do you mean the love of luxury, of extravagance?" "No, no," said Henrietta. "I mean your exposure on the moral side. I approve of luxury. I think we ought to be as elegant as possible. Look at the luxury of our western cities. I've seen nothing over here to compare with it. I hope you'll never become grossly sensual, but I'm not afraid of that. The peril for you is that you live too much in the world of your own dreams. You're not enough in contact with reality, with the toiling, striving, suffering. I may even say sinning, world that surrounds you. You're too fastidious. You've too many graceful illusions. Your newly acquired thousands will shut you up more and more to the society of a few selfish and heartless people who will be interested in keeping them up." Isabel's eyes expanded as she gazed at this lurid scene. "What are my illusions?" she asked. "I try so hard not to have any." "Well," said Henrietta, "you think you can lead a romantic life, that you can live by pleasing yourself and pleasing others. You'll find you're mistaken. Whatever life you lead, you must put your soul in it, to make any sort of success of it. And from the moment you do that, it ceases to be romance, I assure you. It becomes grim reality. And you can't always please yourself. You must sometimes please other people. That, I admit, you're very ready to do. But there's another thing that's still more important. You must often displease others. You must always be ready for that. You must never shrink from it. That doesn't suit you at all. You're too fond of admiration. You like to be thought well of. You think we can escape disagreeable duties by taking romantic views. That's your great illusion, my dear. But we can't. You must be prepared on many occasions in life to please no one at all, not even yourself." Isabel shook her head sadly. She looked troubled and frightened. "This, for you, Henrietta," she said, "must be one of those occasions." It was certainly true that Miss Stackpole, during her visit to Paris, which had been professionally more remunerative than her English sojourn, had not been living in the world of dreams. Mr. Bantling, who had now returned to England, was her companion for the first 4 weeks of her stay, and about Mr. Bantling there was nothing dreamy. Isabel learned from her friend that the two had led a life of great personal intimacy, and that this had been a peculiar advantage to Henrietta, owing to the gentleman's remarkable knowledge of Paris. He had explained everything, shown her everything, been her constant guide and interpreter. They had breakfasted together, dined together, gone to the theatre together, supped together, really, in a manner, quite lived together. He was a true friend, Henrietta more than once assured our heroine, and she had never supposed that she could like any Englishman so well. Isabel could not have told you why, but she found something that ministered to mirth in the alliance the correspondent of the Interviewer had struck with Lady Pensil's brother. Her amusement, moreover, subsisted in face of the fact that she thought it a credit to each of them. Isabel couldn't rid herself of a suspicion that they were playing somehow at cross purposes, that the simplicity of each had been entrapped. But this simplicity was on either side none the less honourable. It was as graceful on Henrietta's part to believe that Mr. Bantling took an interest in the diffusion of lively journalism and in consolidating the position of lady correspondents, as it was on the part of his companion to suppose that the cause of the Interviewer, a periodical of which he had never formed a very definite conception, was, if subtly analysed, a task to which Mr. Bantling felt himself quite equal, but the cause of Miss Stackpole's need of demonstrative affection. Each of these groping celibates supplied at any rate a want of which the other was impatiently conscious. Mr. Bantling, who was of rather a slow and a discursive habit, relished a prompt, keen, positive woman, who charmed him by the influence of a shining, challenging eye and a kind of bandbox freshness, and who kindled a perception of raciness in a mind to which the usual fare of life seemed unsalted. Henrietta, on the other hand, enjoyed the society of a gentleman who appeared somehow, in his way, made, by expensive, roundabout, almost quaint processes, for her use, and whose leisured state, though generally indefensible, was a decided boon to a breathless mate, and who was furnished with an easy, traditional, though by no means exhaustive, answer to almost any social or practical question that could come up. She often found Mr. Bantling's answers very convenient, and in the press of catching the American post would largely and showily address them to publicity. It was to be feared that she was indeed drifting towards those abysses of sophistication as to which Isabel, wishing for a good-humoured retort, had warned her. There might be danger in store for Isabel, but it was scarcely to be hoped that Miss Stackpole on her side would find permanent rest in any adoption of the views of a class pledged to all the old abuses. Isabel continued to warn her good-humouredly. Lady Pensil's obliging brother was sometimes, on our heroine's lips, an object of irreverent and facetious allusion. Nothing, however, could exceed Henrietta's amiability on this point. She used to abound in the sense of Isabel's irony, and to enumerate with elation the hours she had spent with this perfect man of the world, a term that had ceased to make with her as previously for opprobrium. Then, a few moments later, she would forget that they had been talking jocosely, and would mention with impulsive earnestness some expedition she had enjoyed in his company. She would say, "Oh, I know all about Versailles. I went there with Mr. Bantling. I was bound to see it thoroughly. I warned him when we went out there that I was thorough. So we spent 3 days at the hotel and wandered all over the place. It was lovely weather. A kind of Indian summer, only not so good. We just lived in that park. Oh yes, you can't tell me anything about Versailles." Henrietta appeared to have made arrangements to meet her gallant friend during the spring in Italy. Chapter 21